What is up, y'all? Welcome back to Rough Drafts. My name is Sam Pratt. Today we are going to be talking about Cube. This episode is going to be titled Cube 101, and it's going to be targeted primarily at people who play a lot of Limited, but have expressed some hesitation about jumping into Cube, or don't know like where to start. I'm going to be exploring like the differences between Retail Limited, Booster Draft Limited, and Cube Draft Limited. Maybe you are someone that jumped into like the Arena Cube when it was online and it didn't go very well and you don't really know what you did wrong. So we're going to be diving into like a lot of the differences between Limited and Cube, and just kind of exploring like baseline Cube strategies. Most of the discussion in this episode is going to be targeted around the public online cubes. So that would be the Vintage Cube or the Arena Cube. I'm sure I'll also reference my own cube, which as a 540 card cube shares a lot of like similarities philosophically with those other two cubes. The episode next week, I'm going to be titling Cube 201, and it's going to have more discussion about like funkier cubes, or like cube as more of like a creative outlet and how to jump into maybe like a monocolor cube or a cube with like rules modifications or something like that. I'm going to start the episode just kind of like selling Cube a little bit. I'm going to talk about why I love Cube. And one of the main reasons I love Cube is that I think that a good Cube highlights all of the great parts of Limited. So if a draft format is imbalanced, there's not really anything that Wizards can do to fix it. If a cube is unbalanced, like the color balance is off, the cube designer can take action to change that. So the end result is most cubes are very balanced in terms of what is good to do in the cube, which leads to a lot of decision trees in the draft where taking the best cards in the pack will lead you down different routes draft after draft. I also love brewing in drafts. I love like cooking something up with a build around. I love being able to have like some sort of self-expression on what I want to do during the draft. And I think that is abundant in Cube in general. A lot of people like playing cubes like the Vintage Cube because it's fun to play with powerful cards. I think that's a very legitimate reason to be into Cube, is just being able to play with really powerful cards that you don't really get a chance to play with in other formats. Like Limited formats with powerful cards is much, much different than Booster Draft Limited. And because of the complexity of the cards in a lot of cubes, oftentimes cubes have a really high ceiling on how challenging the gameplay is. All of these are reasons that I really love playing Cube in general. As a Cube designer, I love being able to design a cube that highlights the aspect of the game that I really like and being able to share that with someone. It's kind of like building a commander deck that does something, except you're building a commander deck that could do like 20 things, and you also force 8 different people to play with it. If that sells you at all. I'm kind of extolling the virtues of Cube. And you might ask, like, why not always play Cube? A lot of people do always play Cube. That is a very valid way to play Magic. I really like Booster Draft Limited because it's a brand new puzzle with game pieces that I've never played with before every couple of months. I really like the community aspect of breaking a brand new Limited format, like jumping in, not knowing the color balance, figuring things out in the first couple of weeks. And I think just like the vibes of either are different. To me, they're sort of, they're both great. I play a lot of Booster Draft Limited, obviously, and Cube. And I think they have different strengths. And I think like playing a balance of them has really gotten me in a healthy place in like what I enjoy about Magic in general. So what are the differences between Booster Draft and Cube? The main difference, in my opinion, is what people call the power band. The power band is just sort of referring to, you could think of it like the difference in power level between the worst card in the set and the best card in the set. In Retail Limited, there's a very, very wide power band by design because people have baked in different rarities into the booster packs. So, you play with commons that are just like a 2-mana 2/2 with minimal upside, or like even worse cards. And then you also play with like the most powerful mythic rares in the set that were designed for Constructed. In most cubes, or at least in like the Arena or Vintage Cube, some people have designed cubes that you collate like a booster pack, like with a 1 rare per pack, for instance. But like the most popular cubes, the cubes that I'm centering this discussion around, the power band is relatively small. So what I mean is, like, obviously there's going to be cards that are the best cards in the cube, and especially in Vintage Cube, those cards are going to have like a very high ceiling. I'm going to talk about like how to identify the most powerful cards in a cube. But like all of the quote unquote worst cards in the cube are still like good cards. Like the worst card might be like some grizzly bear. Like I said, like in the booster draft, like the worst card might be like a 2-mana 2/2 with minimal upside. The worst card in the cube might be like a grizzly bear variant, but it's going to be like a bulk rare from a standard set. Like the power band in most of these cubes is a lot smaller by design than a retail limited set where you're playing with commons and mythics intentionally. I like to think of cube as halfway between limited and constructed. Obviously, you draft like a limited deck. There's a lot of like limited heuristics that carry over. The deck building's very similar. You kind of have to stay on your toes, but you're playing with more powerful things. And as a result, the way that you get an edge in drafting and deck building most of the time is making sure that your deck like plays a certain way and cares about something. In Booster Draft Limited, you can really get by just coasting on card quality. Or at least maybe not get by, but you can understanding card quality and maximizing card quality will go a long way. Like if your draft deck is full of a bunch of C pluses, like say you have all C pluses, that's going to be a very solid draft deck. If you have mono C pluses in cube, you are going to get outscaled by people who are able to combine cards in certain ways to make really high ceilings, at least in most cubes. I have talked a little bit about how I feel about the actual official arena cube, where I do think that just like picking the best cards and picking a lot of colors and just trying to like play all of them kind of leads to a pretty good strategy. But I don't think this is the case in like Vintage Cube. Like just picking cards that you think are pretty good, putting them all in a deck and hoping it plays out is going to get outscaled by people doing really broken stuff. It's not really like you need to build like a synergistic engine in every cube, but you really want to make sure that your deck has a plan and you really want to be aware of cards that are working against that plan. So for example, like if you're an aggro deck in retail limited, most of the time you're still playing two colors and you're just going to like have some cards that are just like good cards that have stats and can attack and block, or more specifically can attack. But in cube, most of the aggro decks, I would say, lean much closer to like monocolor or monocolor with a splash in a lot of cubes. A big reason for that is that when aggro is supported in cubes, there's such a reliance on 1-drops to get on the board early and start pressuring. And you really want all of your 1-drops to be like mostly in one color so that you can build your mana base in a way to where you can reliably cast those on one. And in cube, a card that kind of just has stats, can attack and block, is going to be much less effective in your streamlined aggressive deck than it would be in a streamlined aggressive deck in a booster draft. So I think just right out the gate, that's like my big philosophical difference in drafting a cube versus drafting a retail limited set. Is in a cube, I'm trying to put together like an archetypal plan for my deck. Like I'm really focusing in on, I'm into white because of a couple good white cards. Am I going to build like an aggressive deck, or am I going to build like a control deck, or maybe just a mid-range deck with really good interaction? Like that is at the forefront of my mind. I am building something out of these cards. And a lot of booster draft sets, you don't really need to think that hard about it because your decks are going to be closer to just like good card mid-range. So I want to hone in a little bit on shifting card evaluation in cube to determining what the actual good cards in a cube are. And most people are referring to these as power outliers. Power outliers being the cards in the cube that are a step above the other cards in the cube that you can identify as like the most powerful cards in a pack, the most powerful cards in the cube, which cards are worth like getting into a color for. In retail limited, this is like pretty easy. Usually it's like a couple commons and then some uncommons and a lot of the rares. Because cubes mostly aren't rarity distributed, it can be harder to find what the actual power outliers are. So I want to spend some time talking about what makes a card powerful relative to the cube that it's in. So I've identified 3 traits of a card that could lead it to be a power outlier in its cube. And I think that the real power outliers have 2 or 3 of these qualities. So these 3 qualities are impact, efficiency, and uniqueness. I'm going to start with impact, and by impact I just mean the effect that this card has on the game, sort of its presence on the game. These are going to be pretty ambiguous, but I'll give some good examples of what types of cards have these qualities. Impact is a quality that I think is shared between Power Outliers in Retail Limited and Power Outliers in Cube, and this sort of just means the impact on the game, like what it does for its mana cost. Does it do like something ridiculous? I think this category also shares a lot of common cards between Retail Limited and Cube. So I'm talking about a card like Sheoldred the Apocalypse. This card isn't particularly cheap. It costs 4 mana. It doesn't have an enters ability. It doesn't generate value, but it has such an immediate impact on the board because as long as it's sitting there, the opponent is going to be slowly losing their life. You're going to be gaining the life. It has such a strong passive effect on the game and is like well statted for its body that has a very high impact on the game and is a must kill threat in a lot of scenarios. Other cards with high impact could generate a lot of value. A good example of a card that I think is really good both in large high power level cubes and in Retail Limited is like Overlord of the Mistmoors from Duskmourn. That has it's still a pretty expensive card. You know, you can cast it for 7 or 4, but the 4 mana mode of make 2 tokens and then get something later is still just like really good on rate. And it becomes like the game becomes all about Overlord of the Mistmoors. Quantum Riddler is another card in recent memory that has like this 2 mana buyout mode, but like the effect that you get for 5 mana is just really strong in both Retail Limited and in Cube. A Cube specific card with a really high impact is Minskin Boo, which just does like a million busted ridiculous things and never should have been legal in 2-player formats. So I think impact is pretty easy to see coming from Booster Draft Limited. Like, just does the card do something very impressive on its own? The next category, efficiency, I think is one of the more defining traits that differentiates cards that are good in Cube versus cards that are good in Booster Draft Limited. In most cubes, cards being cheap is a really, really big deal. One of the big problems that people coming from Booster Draft Limited to Cube have is they really over-index on 4 and 5 drops that they think have a high impact, but don't actually affect the game in a way that is meaningful above the other cards at that mana value. Cube games tend to be a lot faster because you're playing with more powerful cards at each turn of mana. So like the 2 drops are better, the 1 drops are better, the 3 drops are better. Cards are just more powerful, so things are going to end quicker, which means that cheap cards are really important both in deploying cheap, efficient threats and in efficient removal to interact with your opponent's board. So I think that these high impact cards that I listed that are very impressive both in Booster Draft Limited and in Cube are kind of the outliers. Most of the Cube like staples, like in Vintage Cube, Psychic Frog, Ragavan, Mother of Runes, these cards are really impressive because they're able to come down so early. A card in recent memory is like Elegy Acolyte from Edge of Eternities, which is actually in my cube. It's fine. It's like a pretty good 4-drop. This card was broken in Edge of Eternities Limited. And in Cube, it's just like not that much better than your average black 4 or 5 drop in like Vintage Cube or Arena Cube. Like it can have its moments, but it's much more replaceable. And your deck really can't afford to have that many 4-drops. Like you will play Sheoldred the Apocalypse over it basically every time. Like Sheoldred does something that's very unique, which is the next trait I'm going to talk about. That makes it a much more valuable 4-drop than something like Elegy Acolyte. This is especially true, I mentioned this earlier, for interaction. Like cheap interaction, cheap, efficient, versatile interaction is really impressive in Cube as well. But I'm going to give interaction sort of its own section later on, so I'll cover that there. The last trait is uniqueness. And I would say this is the most defining characteristic when you compare Retail Limited to Cube. So uniqueness, I mean like cards that do something that other cards don't, or at a rate that other cards can't offer. and it has to do something that's important. So this is the hardest to read. I would say it's not super relevant for the official arena cube, but I do think this concept of uniqueness really applies to vintage cube, where you have certain combo pieces that are very strong and also irreplaceable. A very good example is the card Flash, which, if you don't know what this is, it is a 2-mana blue instant. You can put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield and then you sacrifice it. So you basically are paying 2 mana to get some cards enters ability or dies ability. So this could be dumping an Atraxa and drawing 5 cards. This could be dumping World Spine Worm and getting 15 power. There are reanimator effects in Vintage Cube. Obviously, there are cards like Sneak Attack, Natural Order that can cheat things into play. But Flash is like kind of the only blue card that does it at this rate, which is why like you see Flash being so important in Vintage Cube. I would say another card similar in its uniqueness is Nadu. And Nadu's kind of like a build around combo deck. When you have Nadu, you can like do the Nadu thing. You can build around Nadu, but Nadu is the only thing that does Nadu, you know? And I think like Shieldred is another pretty good example where Shieldred is a very strong card on her own in Vintage Cube. But once you have Shieldred, you also get to unlock the synergies with forcing your opponent to draw 7 cards with cards like Time Twister so that they take 14 damage. And it's not the only card that does it. That's why I'm kind of saying that the biggest power outliers have a combination of these 3 traits of efficiency, impact, and uniqueness. And I would say that Shieldred is like very unique as a 4-drop, and it also has a high impact on the game. It doesn't always have to be combo enablers. In my own cube, I have Ancient Tomb. There's very few cards in my cube that give you fast mana. And Ancient Tomb is one of the only ones, along with like Chrome Mox is basically the only other one that does it at colorless, like outside of green. So Ancient Tomb for me is a power outlier, both kind of all 3 traits. It's a very efficient, it's a land, it has a high impact in the game, and it's very unique as the only fast mana enabler. And like I said, I just want to point out that really it's a combination of these. So identifying power outliers is a matter of sort of vibing out the sense of what the power level overall of the cube is, and identifying cards that are especially efficient for what they do, especially powerful in their impact on the game, and then finding cards that do something that no other cards do that might be valuable to you in the draft. So a lot of times my cube drafts are built around identifying what sort of the most powerful cards are, just like retail limited, and building around them. But how hard you stick to the power outliers really changes in cube versus retail limited. And hopefully like identifying these 3 traits of efficiency, impact, and uniqueness can help you sort of pick out the power outliers from the rest of the pack when you're presented a pack of 15 cards and they're all like bomb rares in their respective limited formats. All right, let's talk a little bit about interaction. Interaction's very important in Cube. Like I said, things get started a lot faster in Cube. Games end a lot faster in Cube. You want to be able to match your opponent's starts, whether this is a broken thing they're doing in Vintage Cube and you want like free counter spells like Force of Will, or you want to match like your opponent's aggro start and be able to not die to like a 1-drop, 2-drop, 2-drop plus 1-drop curve. I would say that most cubes, remember I'm centering this discussion around like Arena Cube, Magic Online, Vintage Cube, my own cube. They'll have like a couple of removal spells that are cut above the rest, and then a bunch of other ones that are kind of interchangeable. And the ones that are a cut above the rest are ones that are very efficient for what they do. Again, efficiency is so key in Cube. I think in Vintage Cube, a really good example is Swords to Plowshares. This is like one of the top cards in the cube. It's very flexible. It answers any creature for 1 mana for no, like, you don't give them like a card, you just give them life. Swords is a premium card in Vintage Cube, and there's a lot of other really strong white interactive pieces. A couple examples are like Winds of Abandon, Council's Judgment, Unexpectedly Absent. These are all cards that I like. I've put these in my white, like, aggressive decks plenty of times, or just like mid-range decks. I've put these in my white decks plenty of times, but they're kind of like interchangeable. They all kind of like do the same thing roughly at the same or similar rate. and you don't really need to prioritize them because there's a bunch of them. This is kind of the uniqueness as well. Like swords is uniquely efficient for what it does. So I think identifying like the 1 mana interaction like swords, lightning bolt, fatal push sometimes, etc. Like these cards are like especially efficient and sort of catch all and have like a bunch of different modes. And then you want interaction also to round your deck out most of the time. And the second tier is stuff that like you can kind of just pick up when it's convenient. I think this is a lot different than normal retail limited, where removal is often at a premium because of its scarcity. You know, not every format, but like sometimes you just do need to have cards that can answer everything. And in a lot of cubes, there's just like not that much pressure to pick up removal like that because it's at less of a premium. And some decks also just like are doing something so strong and proactive that you don't really need that many removal spells at all. I think one of the other really important things to know about approaching cube draft is the difference in how you prioritize mana. Most like limited environments, like you'll pick up a dual land or an evolving wilds kind of when it's convenient, but it's not really like a priority in the draft unless you're splashing. And even then splashing's oftentimes like not really what you want to be doing unless it's convenient. In cube, because every card is good, every card is valuable and does something in most cubes, you generally end up with significantly more playables than you would in booster draft limited. Like the cards going like 11, 12, 13, 14, 15th pick are still going to be valuable, good cards to you oftentimes. So there's way more space to take lands during the draft. And because cube is so powerful, you want to like really make sure that you can cast your spells on time because things are so efficient in cube. And I will say that in most cubes, the fixing is strong. The fixing is good. We'll talk about some exceptions next week in some weirder cubes, but most cubes, there is ample opportunity to pick fixing. And I would say as a general rule, I tend to not pick up fixing until I know that I'm in a specific color pair. However, once I do know what color pair I'm in, I will pick up the dual lands for that color pair extremely aggressively, like over everything that isn't like a power outlier or something that my deck desperately needs, because it's so important to be able to have good mana in cube, way more important than in regular limited, because you just have like less time in general to wait for your mana base to sort itself out. So like I said, I'm not speccing on random lands. Like I'm not taking fixing in general over everything. Like I don't consider lands super high pick in cube until I know what my color pairs are. The exception to that is if you're drafting a cube with fetch lands, which is very present in the arena cube and present in the vintage cube. If you don't know what's going on with fetch lands, it's a card like Bloodstained Mire, which can tap sack itself to get a swamp or a mountain, but it does not say basic swamp or mountain. So you can get duals and shock lands with your fetch lands. So a Bloodstained Mire could get a Godless Shrine, a black-white land, or it could get a Stomping Ground, a red-green land. Or if you just have like Blood Crypt in your deck, Bloodstained Mire is an extra copy of Blood Crypt. Or you could fetch a Blood Crypt with a Polluted Delta, which is a blue-black fetch land. If you've never drafted with fetch lands, this is something that I make sure people know that maybe are new to cube or drafting in general before they draft a cube with fetch lands, is that fetch lands themselves are very, very high picks because they are so flexible. Because if you pick up Bloodstained Mire and you end up in red-green, Bloodstained Mire is still making your deck and it still functions as an extra copy of Stomping Ground. Like it's effectively a red-green dual land in your deck. So because of this, because fixing is so important and fetch lands are so flexible in the draft, these tend to be very, very high picks in the draft. Like a lot of cube tier lists are focused around like, these are all the cards that I would take over a fetch land, pack one, pick one. Like they're that good because they're so flexible. And also fetch lands also unlock certain synergies like landfall, like delve or escape, or like delirium. They just do a lot of little things in addition to being very valuable mana fixing tools. I think to tie this all together, I would really recommend what I mentioned towards the top of the episode in terms of really focusing on your deck having a plan. That plan could be a specific synergy space. It could be your deck being a streamlined aggro deck, being a streamlined control deck, but really learning how to approach cubes well. In terms of the difference between Booster Draft Limited and Cube is the fact that just generic good card piles really don't cut it in most cubes. And I think that having a vision of what your deck should look like at the end of the draft really leads to a lot of success in the cube space. And obviously, if you're someone that is just jumping into Cube for the first time, that's going to be difficult. I would really recommend, if you're interested in learning Cube, watching, whether that be the Magic Online Vintage Cube or the Arena Cube and stuff like that, watching some content on people who are good at Cube, Draft the Cube, because you'll start to really get a sense of what the good decks kind of look like and sort of understand the 2-card, the 3-card, the synergy combos that exist within the cube and how to sort of plan your draft out as you're drafting it to go into those specific lanes. So that's going to wrap it up. You can probably tell I'm pretty passionate about Cube. I love Cube. Like I said, I love the balance of playing a lot of Booster Draft Limited and playing a lot of Cube. I think they're similar in the ways that I really like in terms of what drafting is, and a lot different in that they give a lot of variety to the types of games of Magic that you can play by playing either of them. So if you've been skeptical about jumping into one of the online cubes, I would say really give it a shot, go with an open mind, maybe watch a little content first to prepare. Don't hesitate to learn Magic Online to play Vintage Cube. Magic Online is really not as hard as it seems. I promise if you spend like an hour or two just trying to get the hang of it, you'll pick it up in not too long. Yeah, that's going to wrap it up. Next week is going to be, it's going to be called Cube 201. I focused all of the discussion very intentionally this week around the big Magic Online, Magic Arena cubes, like these big public cubes. The cube scene is so much more than that. I'm releasing these leading up to CubeCon in Madison, Wisconsin, which I will be at. That really showcases like the whole variety of what people are doing in the cube space. It's a very cool, creative space that I really like. So I'm going to highlight some like funkier cube archetypes next week, maybe like monocolor cubes or cubes with like rules modifications, etc. If you want to reach out to me, you can find me on Blue Sky at sampratt.bsky.social, Discord at samp6, and I stream very occasionally on Twitch at samp_MTG. Thanks for listening. See you next week.